listening to Emerging Global from IntelliNews.
I'm Matthew Cohen, and today I am joined by Adelle Nazarian. Now, Adelle is an American media personality and global entrepreneur. As a geopolitical strategist, media powerhouse, and human rights advocate with over 15 years at the intersection of journalism, global consulting, and geopolitical and governmental affairs, as well as tech, Adelle brings unmatched insights to the world's most pressing issues. Adelle, thank you for joining me today.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Matthew. I'm really looking forward to a very fruitful conversation.
As am I. So, as the title of the podcast suggests, we are discussing the art of the deal gone global. Now, while US President Trump certainly has similar ideological alignments as he did during his first term of office, it seems that he's really on a different pace when it comes to his second term. We've noticed a vast acceleration in the speed at which he's looking to implement policies, not only from a domestic standpoint, but also in terms of foreign affairs across the globe. So, Adelle, I'd like us to start a little bit closer to home, specifically Latin America, and particularly, let's begin with Venezuela. Now, in February, the US revoked oil licenses from the Biden administration, which allowed US companies to operate in Venezuela. Now, this would directly affect the joint license between Chevron and the state-run oil company. So in May, if we speed up a little bit, it appeared as if the US might do a U-turn after the release of American detainees in Venezuela was discussed. However, we then saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio announce on social media that the oil licenses would indeed expire as originally intended. So, Adelle, what I'd like to know is, what do you think the implications will be for the state-run oil company as well as the US companies who were involved in Venezuela?
It's a great and important question. Matthew, I think that the revocation of these oil licenses was really a strategic gut punch to Maduro's lifeline, right? Even Chevron's joint venture with PDVSA, Venezuela's state-run oil company, it was a calibrated economic strike, which basically was designed to squeeze Venezuela's authoritarian regime at its so-called fiscal jugular, if you want to call it that, right? And PDVSA, of course, relies on partnerships like Chevron and Exxon, not just for capital, but of course for its global legitimacy, basic operational survival. And what this does is it will make it difficult for PDVSA to attract, is most likely increase the dependence on Chinese and Iranian oil infrastructure deals that come with, of course, strings and sovereignty costs as well. So just to add to this, right, for PDVSA, of course, this is an existential blow. It's a huge blow to them. Chevron's exit, of course, is a symbolic humiliation. Think about it. One of the last remaining Western firms that were still operating in the country, legitimizing basically PDVSA's operations, has literally dissipated. Do I think that Venezuela could change Trump's mind? Nothing's impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely, right? Also, if you couple that with the vast human rights issues, so many Venezuelans who are seeking, legal safe harbor or illegal for that matter in the US. We see what's happening in California, but a lot of Venezuelan expats, right? They're just absolutely, they escaped Maduro's reign. And I think basically, while Trump is obviously, he's not a transactional leader in the traditional diplomatic sense, although he's extremely transactional in a business sense. He is, I guess you can call him an ideological transactional nationalist, right? He may entertain a pivot, which is unlikely in this case, but I think only if it aligns with his America First optics. What could essentially sway him if he wanted to go there? Of course, strategic leverage against China, right? That would be, let's say Venezuela comes forward and offers intelligence or logistical disruption to Chinese operations in Latin America, which of course China has a very heavy presence there, or to curb Iran's footprint, which Iran has an even stronger footprint in Latin America, and particularly in Venezuela, right? That could catch Trump's eye. That could be one way. There's, of course, resource diplomacy. Let's call it that, right? With Maduro offering, let's say, exclusive access for the U.S. to strategic minerals, rare earths, right? Lithium reserves, which it has. This also ties into, of course, the Essequibo. Yeah, Exactly.
Guyana.
Exactly. Which is it's a huge issue too. Complete power grab. I think, honestly, Matthew, Maduro's aggression and, increased focus on Essequibo is a direct result of this termination of the PDVSA deal, basically. All the sanctions.
Well, I guess in that sense, he's really just deepening the rift.
He is.
On one hand, you saw, well, in the recent Venezuelan elections, there were so many accusations of electoral fraud and rigging.
Absolutely.
From the US, from a lot of the Western allies, and from Latin American neighbors as well. I mean, in fact, I actually remember how Chile, which is a pretty leftist government at the moment, also condemned Maduro and spoke of how they do not think, or specifically the president of Chile believes he does not think that Maduro is the legitimate leader. So I guess that also adds a little bit of fuel to the fire.
Absolutely. And I think that that's part of it is also the strength that he's finding, just like Chile's leader are saying that, is because they're seeing that Trump is going to do what he says, and they kind of have an ally now, right? And they're not so afraid to stand up and speak what's on their mind. But, I will say this, right? I don't think that the Trump-Rubio, if you want to call it axis, I don't think it's seeking disengagement. This is another bargaining chip. What they want to do is reassert U.S. primacy in the Western Hemisphere, rightly so. Venezuela is arguably a test case for this. And they're signaling by doing this to Cuba, to Nicaragua, and to Brazil. Basically, play by our rules or be economically exiled. And I think this sends a very strong message to other Latin American countries who are also, basically facing potentially or on the let's say the fence as to where they want to go. So I think that this is a very, very strong way of reasserting U.S. primacy, as I said, and I think that Essequibo obviously is a global energy flashpoint. It's right.
Well, and other
ExxonMobil
majors all stepping in there. They're yes, in offshore developments such as the Starbrook Block. It's a lucrative opportunity for them.
Absolutely. And of course, just to add to that, Guyana has arguably now become the litmus test for the rule of law in Latin America, right? The international community, right? CARICOM, I think it's called, right? It's the U.S. and Brazil. It must defend, and they have vowed, I think, to defend Guyana's territorial integrity. I guess you can kind of compare this in a sense to, China and Taiwan. Right. The U.S., of course, stating that it has a doctrinal obligation and they will support Taiwan should China invade. Similarly, I think Maduro, he escalates and he goes too far into Guyana. And of course, we know this is actually more of a dispute between the Netherlands and the UK, which were the original, the owners, right, colonizers. But basically, if he pushes too hard, of course, the U.S. is going to intervene and to support Guyana when it comes to this. Right. I'm not mistaken. I think that's what's going to happen. So,
well, you bring up a really interesting point, specifically when it came to the sort of ideological split that you see in Latin America, and how, of course, you've got those sort of powers such as Argentina that seem very strongly aligned with the Trump administration, as we've seen in certain others such as Ecuador, Paraguay. However, something that's really interesting is that there seems to be an outlier when it comes to those countries that seem to ideologically oppose the Trump administration's political leanings, so to speak. And that's Mexico. Now, despite President Claudia Sheinbaum's leftist leanings, she seems very willing to compromise with the Trump administration. And contrary to the likes of Venezuela, Mexico actually seems to be strengthening its ties with the US. Now, we've heard the news of Marco Rubio planning his first trip to Mexico in his capacity as Secretary of State. And we've also heard around the same time Sheinbaum really praised the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And it seems as if she's really looking to promote its longevity and ensure that it remains intact, which would actually be a logical step given that the US accounts for about 80% of Mexico's exports. But aside from the trade standpoint, I think it's also notable that back in February, we saw Mexico deploy its first 10,000 troops to the US border to combat illegal border crossings. And that very month, the US recorded only around 8,450 illegal crossings, which is not just the lowest in decades, but is a sizable difference to what happened under the Biden administration when you'd see about 8,000 crossings a day at certain points. So what I'd like to know from you is, what do you make of this apparent warming of ties? Do you think that this is sustainable? And ultimately, where do you see US-Mexico relations headed?
That's a great question. I mean, look, what you're seeing is the facts don't lie. The numbers don't lie, right? The facts don't care about your feelings. Sounds familiar. Very funny, right? If you're my former colleague. It's true. And the numbers indicate clearly that her deployment of those 10,000, troops to help on the border has definitely Mexican troops in the U.S. border. Yeah, you're right. It is a very, very smart move. She's a leftist, right? But she's also a pragmatic realist. And I think that this is basically, she came out and said also during these riots in LA that are taking place right now, that don't demonize the country or the people. Don't go after the people. She was basically trying to calm Mexicans that are there who are protesting clearly. I think what this does is, sorry, let me back up a little bit to answer your question. She's signaling something rare, ideological flexibility, right? In the face of, let's say, geopolitical necessity, if you want to call it that. So she's basically embracing a pragmatic path of cooperation, which is true, but she's also not abandoning her principles. She's not letting them sabotage her geopolitical calculus, which is what she's doing also. And I think she's not retreating, which is obvious. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the US. So the survival of her presidency, economically and politically, depends on maintaining this stable, productive trade relationship. And I think this is what she's doing. She's doing this strategically. That's why she's trying to but she's warming the relations while balancing the crisis, right? And, I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio's visit there is, going to be a soft power reset for the US and Latin America. I really do. It's essentially, I'd say, the beginning of a realignment or a shift of the hemispheric, let's say, powers that be, a hemispheric realignment, right? And
Sure.
Right. I think that it will result most likely and trustfully in the expansion of bilateral security cooperation, maybe new energy deals and tech partnerships. They can turn to working on a reinvigorated counter-cartel strategy using, U.S. air and intelligence support. I think that they're essentially playing chess, right? They're playing chess. I think that surprisingly, if you compare even the last administration in Mexico, which was a very, very detente type relationship and standoffish, of course, with regards to the Trump first term, we may be pleasantly surprised to see that Mexico might end up emerging as Trump's most valuable and surprising partner in Latin America. And I say Latin America because, of course, in the Middle East, it's going to be Israel and the UAE. But in Latin America, I think Mexico could emerge as a really rising star. Who would have thought that compared to 8 years ago that this would be the case?
Right. I guess it's just very interesting because when we look at Sheinbaum, and then of course her government as well, because she's just the leader, but you got to have an organization behind you. It really seems as if Mexico is almost an enigma of sort in Latin America because, of course, those ideologically aligned countries, they welcomed the second Trump term with open arms. And then, of course, we saw the sort of rhetoric coming out of the ideological opponents. But what we've seen here is a real delicate balance because
definitely,
though we know there's a clash of values, we know there's a clash in multiple policies, yet it seems almost as if here's a leader who's decided to put country ahead of politics.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like you said. I mean, this could be a very bright future for US-Mexico relations.
Yeah, I really do think so. I think it was interesting. If I'm not mistaken, it was about, I can tell you precisely. I think it was, because I posted, I think it was 2 months ago, that in the face of the tariffs war between the US and China, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, she basically has signed a deal to let Shein and Temu come to Mexico. And this is interesting because if you think of the 80% of the exports from Mexico go to the US, right? And how do we know, this is a different topic altogether, but how do we know that those aren't going to be Temu and Shein products, Chinese products? But that's a funny discussion we could have another time. But I think you're right. She's very clever. She's very clever, and she is putting her country over politics. And I think that in her case, in her situation, that is a very nationalistic thing to do. And it's going to win the hearts of minds, I think, of many people that are in her country. I really do.
I've got to agree with you on that. And it's something we don't see very often. So it is refreshing.
Definitely.
As well, while we're on the topic of those who cooperate, I think let's shift to another country where not only do we see cooperation, but I would say a full embrace of what the Trump administration is trying to do. And that's El Salvador.
Definitely. And where would that be?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
No, I said, where would that be?
Not too far geographically.
Salvador.
Not too far away. Well, in February, we saw the beginning of some pretty interesting talks when Rubio met with El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele. And during those discussions, Bukele aired his willingness to house US deportees in Salvadorian prisons. Now, at the time, we didn't quite know what this would look like, but things have really accelerated in the months that have followed. And in March, we saw the US pay El Salvador around $6 million to house members of the Tren de Aragua and MS-13 gangs, which of course do have a presence in the United States. Now, the deportation of these illegal migrants was performed under the 1798 Alien Enemies Act. Yet just days ago, we saw Salvadorian citizen Kilmar Arrego Garcia brought back to the US after being deported back to El Salvador. And it seemed as if the US had determined that he was mistakenly deported. And so his charges, his criminal charges, will be faced in the US by US courts. So, Adele, could you maybe explain a little bit more about why the deportation deal appears to be so controversial, why you see these different NGOs and certain lawyers oppose it? And once you've done that, this is a bit of a two-pronged question, but once we've assessed that, would you actually say that the deal is a net positive or a net negative, given the benefits, but also the holes that seem to be appearing in the deal?
That's great. Yeah, this is a very loaded and charged case, honestly. The Alien Enemies Act of 1790, I think it was originally designed to basically detain foreign nationals during wartime. Right? Arguably, you can argue this in front of a court, no judge, and there's loopholes in this where are we in the midst of a war? Some may say yes, some may say no. The definition of war also has evolved, right? War was very, very cut and dry, black and white back in the day. Now we have the cyber warfare. We have other forms of warfare, right? So I guess we can argue that...
You could say that this is cartel warfare.
Cartel warfare, precisely. That's a fantastic way. I love that term. You should coin it, cartel warfare. And, basically at its core, this... the U.S. and El Salvador deportation arrangement that they had, it's basically a strategic outsourcing of America's criminal burden to a willing strongman in Central America, right? El Salvador. But the controversy arises from the fact that, in this case, what's his name? I'm so sorry. Kilmar Arrego Garcia, right? He was essentially just fast-tracked of being deported without having due process. And of course, during the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, this was more than likely a scenario. America said that they wouldn't take him back under any circumstances, and now they've agreed to take him back, and he is being charged with trafficking. And it's controversial also because some of the statements that he gave weren't exactly accurate, but then there's not, let's say, any sort of solid evidence to show that he actually did traffic any humans. There was a big debate over whether he started in the Lone Star State, Texas, and then went over to, I think, Florida. I don't know what his destination was, I forgot, but this is all kind of, up for grabs. In cases, there have been incidents where, of course, certain people have been used as pawns to meet examples of. I'm not saying this is the case with Kilmar Arrego Garcia, but I think that there's definitely a it's a tough case. I don't think personally that the Trump administration would, charge him with the trafficking charges if there wasn't something there. It doesn't seem par for the course for what he's done. Other administrations, yes, I think they would, they have, but I don't see Trump doing that. So there has to be something there, and I'm sure they'll get to the bottom of it. Of course, if you want to look at it, right, these mega prisons that, President Nayib Bukele has offered up to house deportees in his country. Keep in mind, these members who have been incarcerated are MS-13 and Tren de Aragua members, Venezuelan gang members from Tren de Aragua. So he's basically helping the U.S. rid itself of hardened criminals while cementing El Salvador's new role, let's say, as a regional security hub. And in exchange for that, I'm sure your audience knows this, but it was $6 million that was paid from the U.S. to El Salvador in March in order to basically transfer this responsibility and this burden to them. I think that whether or not that granted, I just want to add one more thing, if I may. Of course, this is going to raise human rights and judicial process concerns, right? Of course, this is going to be weaponized, and it has been weaponized by the Trump administration's critics, deeming it unconstitutional. Democrats are having a field day. But I think ultimately the burden rests with the Trump administration and the people he is assigned to check things out and to actually deliver the legal documentation to find out that he was in fact guilty of trafficking. Whether this was a net positive or a net or a negative, right? That again depends on the lens it's being viewed through. It's a 50-50 here. The positive aspects are that there's been an immediate reduction of violent gang members on U.S. soil. This also serves and acts as a deterrent, right? It's a very potent deterrent at that signal to other criminal illegal migrants and cartels to not mess with America's security, national security. What this also does is it strengthens, right, the ties between El Salvador and the U.S. I guess some of the challenges, I'd say ultimately there isn't a net positive or negative. I think that ultimately, if you're looking at it through the lens of, let's say, the everyday Americans who have been affected by this, and the Trump administration's ultimate goals, it's a net positive. I think for El Salvador, the leadership, it's a net positive. But when it comes to, and I'm going to look at this from a different lens right now, because I think it's important to understand, without losing yourself, where some of these actors come from. They are arguably born into disadvantaged situations. I'm not saying it justifies the behavior, the action, but people who have nothing left, they're literally fighting for life, and they choose to either join these cartels, they are recruited into these cartels, there are mental health issues, there's a lens of justice for these so-called freedom fighters. Yeah, people who are calling Hamas freedom fighters, which is obviously, through the lens of Western justice, insane. I'm essentially trying to say that it all depends on the lens, but I think from the Western perspective and from what's actually being done to secure America's and El Salvador's and Latin America's sovereignty and security, it is a net positive.
All right, so could we basically put it down to say that if implemented correctly, of course, implemented being the key word here, it would be a net positive because, of course, yes, there is still the sort of legal concerns. And as you mentioned, you like to look at these issues through different lenses. But it seems to me that it would definitely be leaning towards that net positive. So
exactly.
As due process is followed.
Precisely. And Matthew, if I have to say, if this is to work, let's say flawlessly or close to flawlessly, it'll be hailed as a game-changing migration model. It will save taxpayers in the U.S. so much money, which is part of why DOGE was essentially established, and it crushes transnational gangs at their roots. So it is working to, create a paradigm shift.
No, of course. So seeing as we've covered Latin America quite extensively, I'd like us to shift focus this time to the southern tip of Africa, South Africa, which is actually where I'm calling you from, right?
Yeah. Familiar territory.
Oh, yes. So I think many of our listeners, if not perhaps the vast majority, are sure to have caught that fiery Oval Office meeting between President Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. Adele, were you able to take a look at the encounter?
I was.
Well, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What did you think of that?
I think that it was the Trump Ramaphosa meeting it was less about dialogue, right? Dialogue was there, obviously, but it was it was a warning shot, honestly. Trump was drawing a line in the sand. He didn't, I thought that it was Trump emerged as a strong man. I think he was letting, Cyril Ramaphosa know that this targeting of the whites. I understand that slavery happened. I understand that there was apartheid. I understand all this, but there has to be a line drawn. Like, are your subsequent generations going to be, punished for the crimes of your ancestors, so to speak? Yeah, I thought, though, looking at it from a, over the, let's say, a topical kind of perspective, that Trump definitely emerged as a strongman in this. I don't know if you agree.
Right. No, I do have to agree. I mean, all you had to do is look at some of the camera shots. First of all, of Ramaphosa himself really screaming and cringing in his seat. And then there was, I remember where the video of the Kill the Boer chant was played, and you just saw him covering his face with his hand at a point. So
he should be humiliated.
I agree with you on that.
I mean,
it was a very difficult situation.
Absolutely. It's the Kill the Boer. It's not just a chant anymore, right, Matthew? It's a trigger for policy. I mean, the brutal farm murders, they've made South Africa untenable as a human rights partner. That's for sure, in the eyes of the Trump administration, and honestly for other nations too. We know that America has quietly launched refugee flights for the endangered white South Africans.
So I just want to correct you there. So the flights that are in play, they're not purely for white Afrikaners. They're actually for minorities. So
that's amazing.
3% of South Africa are minorities, meaning non-black, and there are actually non-white minorities who've also been on those flights. Just a little known fact that
Thank you.
Might not realize.
I didn't know that. See?
Right. It doesn't seem to be spoken about in the media too much, but that is the case. It's open to minorities of all backgrounds, and there are some, albeit a small number, that have taken up the offer.
I'll tell you, I'm actually in Sweden right now. I've been traveling throughout Europe and, UAE, all over, and I'm back in the US again in a few weeks. And I actually met a South African couple who are Afrikaan. And they told me that 2 years ago, they have a little girl who's 4. And I said, what made you come to Scandinavia? And they said, well, we fled the situation 2 years ago in our country. And they literally told me they fled to Scandinavia from South Africa. So what I think is, these flights, these evacuations, they're not just symbolic, right? They're, I think, a prelude and a precursor to sanctions, trade freezes, and honestly, full diplomatic downgrades. I mean, when Ramaphosa exited that room with meeting with Trump, he was given a final opportunity to reverse course before getting all these crackdowns that will be implemented. And I believe Trump will implement those. I really, really do.
Right. And it's remarkable to see, but in the meeting, I'm just backtracking a moment, the Kill the Boer chant, pretty soon after getting off his flight, once he left the US and arrived back on South African soil, Ramaphosa was asked about the chant, and yet again doubled down on how it's not a call to action, and no, it's actually a struggle song from back in the apartheid times. Now,
there you go.
There have been a struggle song. During the meeting with President Trump, he himself said, no, we do not tolerate these kinds of calls. Yet the moment he returns to South Africa, he does a complete 180.
What does that tell you? It tells you about the constituents, doesn't it?
The constituents?
Yeah, the people, the non-white, let's say, and non-minority members of South African society. Could it be that he's actually appealing to their sensibilities and what they want to happen?
Actually going to say no.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. So some research has been done in South Africa regarding this song. One particular study that I read was from the Social Research Foundation. And what they found is that the overwhelming majority of South Africans of all races and of all political leanings, because they also checked party support, they oppose this song, the vast majority. In fact, the person who we saw in that video, named Julius Malema, his political party and, well, the voters of the political party were also polled, and the majority, over 50%, also condemned the singing of the song. So it's quite remarkable to see this decision by President Ramaphosa and the ANC. And from what I can tell, and this is just an observation, his decision to double down on this is actually going to infuriate more voters. You know, in the 2024 South African election, it was a real landmark election because for the first time since democracy in 1994, the ANC, which is the party of Cyril Ramaphosa, lost its majority. Now that in 2004, when it was at its peak strength, the party had 70% of the vote. Imagine that, 70%. Today, it has around 40%. It's nearly halved.
That's huge.
Right. And if you want to hear something even more startling, if you look at voter turnout, back in 2004, voter turnout was much higher and over 10 million people voted for the ANC. Today, voter turnout is about 57%. Well, as it was in 2024, over 60%, I think even more of the ANC voter base has eroded. And so what he seems to be doing, at least from my perspective, is a complete self-implosion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that he's enabling basically mob sentiment over the will of the people is what you're saying. Right. I think that he's not a dictator, but he definitely is doing, his leadership is definitely authoritarian in a sense, in that regard. But maybe he's having difficulty even facing and confronting authoritarians in his own ranks, right? Who are maybe pushing him to do this. We don't know. But I think you're right. It's a recipe for disaster for the ANC. And I don't think they're going to win again based on what you're saying.
Right. I tend to agree with you. It seems like the trend is very much set. But what I'd actually like to know from you brought up something very interesting earlier, specifically this idea of sanctions. Adelle, do you believe that sanctions are coming swiftly if the presidency does not back down? And if so, what do you reckon the sanctions will be? What form will they take?
That's a great question. Well, I definitely think sanctions are going to be very swift with South Africa. I definitely do. South Africa also is very, very rich, if I'm not mistaken, rare earth and whatnot. They are. So I have a question for you then. You're probably more of an expert than I am on this, and I have definitely just a reading on it. But what is South Africa? What do they trade with the U.S.?
Look, natural minerals have always been big, specifically platinum. Gold has always been a sort of what South Africa
gold, of course.
For. What's actually quite funny is that one of the names for Johannesburg, the city of Johannesburg, is Igoli. And that actually means the place of gold in English. So yes, you are correct with what you're saying. Mining is still a very important pinnacle of the South African economy. But there are other areas as well.
Yes.
Automobile manufacturing as well.
I think so.
Sounds like you had something to add.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, what I wouldn't put past them is honestly targeting South Africans with Magnitsky-style sanctions. The Magnitsky Act, right? I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Magnitsky Act. That was, of course...
problem. I also wouldn't.
Magnitsky. I had to put on my Russian hat. And of course, that was, I think it was Sergei Magnitsky that had, of course, that was the initial reason why it was started. But in 2006, the Magnitsky Act was actually expanded to the Global Magnitsky Act. And what it does is, instead of just targeting Russians for human rights violations and abuses by freezing their U.S. assets and by preventing them from getting visas to the U.S., it targets everyone. A Magnitsky-style targeting of South African officials, people in the government or affiliated with the government, freezing their U.S. assets, preventing them from being in the U.S., maybe even honestly expulsing them from the U.S. I wouldn't put it past the Trump administration to do this. I mean, this is, I think the Trump administration does take human rights violations very seriously, and not in the same way that necessarily previous administrations had. I think that, now I'm going to put it out there, I think that there has been in the media, Western media, a targeting of, let's say, white and white individuals. And I think that the Trump administration, of course, has also been cracking down on that and pushing back against that. I think especially to see a once U.S. ally, right, South Africa, basically, going in, targeting people who are minorities and white specifically in its own country, also triggers a very soft point, a very, very sore spot with them. So I wouldn't put it past Trump to definitely do that, the Magnitsky-style sanctions. And also, there will be trade pressures probably. There will absolutely be trade pressures. They may even honestly remove I think it's AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, right? That would, of course, devastate South Africa's export industries.
Right. That's something that South Africa's been dreading for quite some time, is the removal of AGOA, which begs the question, why not change course?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's very selfish. Yeah. I don't know when the next elections are being held, but maybe if things continue to worsen.
It's a while. It will only be in 2029.
Yeah. There might even be the international community may have to step in and force a snap election, emergency elections, honestly.
Do you reckon that that's something that the Trump administration would seriously consider, though? Or is that more of an emergency measure?
I honestly think it would be seen as an overt attempt to control the election outcome of another country, obviously. I mean, it's been done in more subtle ways in the past. But look at what the Biden administration State Department did with Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. They essentially came to her and they asked for access to the naval base and military bases there for the U.S., and she denied it. And so they essentially orchestrated a coup style, a coup, basically takeover with the students. I'm not saying the Trump administration would do this at all because he's non-interventionist, but I'm saying I wouldn't put it past the previous administration to do that if it was something that was in their favor. But I think that pressuring international organizations, I think the ICJ, International Court of Justice, and these international human rights organizations cannot deny that this is a human rights violation in the highest degree. It's much smaller in scale to be considered a genocide, let's say, but it definitely is trending along those lines. And I believe that if it does continue, honestly, there may, international community and specifically the Trump administration may in fact suggest it as a emergency intervention to stop the killing of non-Black South Africans.
Yes.
And farmers, yeah.
Yes. Well, I guess that is an important point because, like you said, you brought up the genocide question. You brought up the farm murders. And look, as the statistics in South Africa, the crime statistics show, the majority of the violent crimes, specifically murders, tend to be Black on Black crimes. So
absolutely,
perpetrator, Black victim. Yet, we also need to acknowledge that what's happening on South African farms is not normal.
Of course.
And unfortunately, it seems as if the world often suffers from this whataboutism, where there's this issue, but what about those people? And that's fine. We can discuss that. There's nothing wrong with that. But just because there is, of course, a crime problem affecting all South Africans, it doesn't mean that we should take our eye off the ball here.
Absolutely. And whataboutisms are a real, honestly, issue. They really are. It leads to false equivocation. It's just it's a narcissistic, abusive relationship, I think. It's gaslighting. I swear. It's a form of gaslighting. And you can't just take one issue and then try to say, but look over here, look over here. That's also an issue. And it is a big problem. Sorry, I got a call. I really do hope that with whatever time is left in his office, Trump does. I mean, look, he's done what he said he would do. And arguably, he's had empathy, believe it or not. He hasn't even carried out the full extent of what he said he would do, even though he's done it and he's doing it, which shows I think his assassination attempts have kind of softened him. He's going to do what he's going to do, but have made him use a more strategic lens of how to approach things, let's say. But I think that in whatever time he has left, he should go ahead and go full force and do whatever he can to correct America's position and the Western, powers positioning in the global world of ours. And if it means he goes hard on South Africa's leadership in order to set an example, I really hope that he does do that, as long as it doesn't also affect everyday people to a large degree, because that's always the ones who always suffer the most and end up getting punished for the bad behavior of those in power are the everyday people. And it's an unfortunate consequence of war, but we're in the midst of multiple wars, it seems.
Of course. And I do agree with you. And I think that's an important point, because what's actually unbelievable is just how the government and its current agenda just completely misrepresents the ordinary South African of all racial groups and backgrounds. I mean, generally, there's very low racial tensions in South Africa. And apart from that, South Africans have very warm feelings towards the US. I mean, people are using American lingo when they speak, even though it's South African English, which is derived from British English, music, movies, fashion, you name it. So ultimately, from what I can see and from what we generally see from studies, I mean, the vast majority of South Africans do not want an erosion of South African-US relations. So it's bizarre indeed.
Absolutely.
Just going back to, let's say, a general US standpoint, because of course, I don't want to take up too much of your time.
By the way, Matthew, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I got an incoming phone call. I declined it. It did not disrupt our recording, right?
No.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay. Thank you.
So yes, just before we part ways, I'd like to hear a quick summary, if you will, of how you see not only the US progressing throughout the rest of the Trump administration, but just the US relations worldwide. How do you see life under Trump over the last few years of his presidency?
In the US or globally, or both?
Start off with the US, but you can feel free to add on from a global perspective as well.
Thank you. I think that it's going to be hurting in the short term. I think people are starting to feel the economic impact of the previous administration, the wars that were started, the trillions that were spent, the bottom line, people's pockets, people's wallets, feeling that, their bank accounts. I think Trump was trying, of course, with the tariff wars, that Trump is now trying to use as a tactic to eliminate America's economic primacy and help reinvigorate America's economy. I think people are going to feel a crunch. I just want to point out also the Labubu craze, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Those little...
Yeah, I'm not. You'll have to...
No? These little demonic looking dolls that are, they're like $10, $15 for a little box that comes with these little cute little, devilish, animals that are stuffed animals. But what this indicates is a lipstick effect, which is an economic term that was started by Estee Lauder's founder. One of the Lauder, I don't know if it was Ron or his brother. And what it does is during times when they're in it basically foreshadows an economic recession, where instead of luxury items that are typically receiving a high ticket price, people are still seeking that, that good feeling, the dopamine rush of buying a luxury item at a much lower cost. And so they were rushing at the time to buy, lipsticks. $25, $15, whatever it is, $10, at a time where they couldn't afford, let's say the Chanel bag, the $6,000 Chanel bag, the $12,000, whatever the prices were back then, Hermes, Birkins. So they're turning now to these $10, $15 items that are still considered a luxury item. People are, hanging them on their designer bags, they're hanging them on their backpacks, they're taking them with them as keychains. And I think that what this is signaling is, in fact, an economic recession. That said, I think what President Trump does over the next year, particularly over the next 3 to 6 months, will determine the trajectory of the next 5 years. And I think that if he can make this fast and hard and just make it go quickly, pass by and correct any of the economic issues regarding tariffs and trade wars that are occurring and lingering between China and the US, and obviously to give the impression and actually tangibly give the results of securing America's borders at home and providing an opportunity where American citizens can truly be put first, unlike what's happening in California and other more progressive countries in the union, in the country. I think that it will send a very, very positive message throughout the global markets, and it will also be very, very positive for our home. And I think that there will be an economic opportunity for progress and profitability in the years ahead. So I think that, yes, just to shorten it up again, it'll be tough for the next year or so. Hopefully not more than that. But what he does over the next 3 to 6 months will determine whether or not America will prosper, the people that means, or if there'll be hard times for the next few years to come. And I think what this does will also send reverberations throughout the rest of the world, because the US dollar dictates so much of how people spend internationally. And what it also will do is, of course, the dollar has gone down significantly. I've been seeing it in Europe when I've been traveling to Europe, to Dubai, all these places. But I think what it will also do is increase tourism to the US. When the dollar is low, tourism is high, people are trying to come in, and it'll revitalize the economy indirectly as well. But I'm pretty positive, I'm pretty optimistic. I don't think this is the end of the road for the US by any means. I don't think Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West is going to come to fruition, at least not in our lifetime. And I certainly hope it doesn't in the future, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
Well, that sounds good to hear. Definitely, Adelle. Thank you very much. I appreciate your insights. I'm sure that our listeners will have also found it very entertaining. Where can people find you?
Thank you so much, Matthew. I am on Twitter, or X, on Instagram, on Facebook. It is the handle at Adelle Naz, ADELLENAZ. I thank you so much for having me on with you, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Of course, likewise. I also definitely found it enlightening. That was Adelle Nazarian, and I'm Matthew Cohen for BNE IntelliNews.